We now move into the first panel discussion of the day, which will focus on the question of how policy can address long-term climate inequities in Ireland and beyond. I'd like to welcome now to the podium the chair of the first panel and my colleague, Dr. Ross Carroll, who is an assistant professor in the School of Law and Government.
Thanks, Diarmuid. You're all very welcome back. I think you can agree that we've had a terrific start to today's conference with Mrs. Robinson's speech. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first panel of the conference. And for this panel, we've asked 4 experts, one of whom is on Zoom, you'll see her shortly, to address the question that Diarmuid just mentioned. How can policy and policymakers address the long-term climate inequities in Ireland and in the wider world? As Diarmuid mentioned earlier, unfortunately, Dr. Louise Fitzgerald couldn't make it, but thankfully my colleague, Dr. Darren Clarke, stepped in graciously to take her place. Now, for years, I think it has seemed like policymakers were doing relatively little to address inequities generated by climate change. But recently, there have been some small signs of progress, both globally and here in Ireland. At COP28, leaders agreed to a loss and damage fund to help countries most adversely impacted by climate change, whereas in Ireland, the Climate Act of 2021 called attention to the need for a just transition to a climate-neutral economy. But how will these policy commitments be operationalised, and are they enough to meaningfully address long-term climate injustices? So each of our panellists will begin with some brief comments, 5 minutes or so, on how policy can address these inequalities before we move on to some questions. I'll pose some questions to them, and then I'll open it up to a wider Q&A. So we'll be going to beginning with Dr. Sinead Walsh. Sinead is Climate Director at Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs. Before that, she served as the EU Ambassador to South Sudan. She's been a senior fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and she's been Ambassador of Ireland to Sierra Leone and Liberia, and she served as the head of Irish Aid in those 2 countries. She's also worked in various roles on multilateral organizations, international financial institutions, and civil society engagement. And on top of all of that, she is an author. She's the co-author of Getting to Zero, a doctor and a diplomat on the Ebola frontline, which was published in 2018. Sinead, over to you.
Thanks a million, Ross, and hi, everybody. It's good to good to see you. I want to tell you a little bit this morning. Well, are we still in the morning where we are? Yes, it's been a long morning already. About, I suppose, a few of the ways in which we do kind of policy related to climate justice, because I was thinking about that after I heard about this panel. I think the one that you'll probably be most familiar with is the sort of the COP side of policy, right? So the international climate negotiations. My team and I are certainly very involved in that. It looks like 2 weeks a year, but there's sort of 11 and a half months that are more behind the scenes, that are definitely significantly more boring, I can tell you, and that then lead up to I suppose the COP stuff that gets on the television. I had a bit of an insight last year. Ross mentioned loss and damage, and I was on the transitional committee that was designing the new fund all of last year, and it was a very painful and time-consuming process. Definitely, I think we disagreed on a lot on the committee between the countries, but we all agreed on that. So incredibly intense, very, very legalistic, and really, really different points of view. And maybe just to give you one illustration of that, so Ireland's kind of big priority for the fund on loss and damage was that there should be priority given to, essentially the least developed countries and the small island developing states, right? So the LDCs and the SIDS. And I think for a lot of Irish people, maybe probably for a lot of people in this room, it's a bit of a no-brainer, right? You should give priority to those with least income, those with least capacity to respond, and those who are most vulnerable to climate impacts. But this was a huge fight, and actually it makes sense, right? Because mostly we were fighting with the Latin American countries that were saying, hang on a second, we have huge debt, and every time we have a climate disaster, we have to take out more debt, and then we have, huge repayments and so on. So I suppose one point that I wanted to make is that, climate justice is kind of in the eye of the beholder as well, but I suppose it is all relative, and from an Irish perspective, our big thing is the furthest behind first. So we really sort of held firm to say, yes, all developing countries will be able to seek access to the fund, but we need a guaranteed kind of special prioritization of LDCs and SIDS, and we got that. When I say we got that, it was very much working with the LDCs and the SIDS together to push that through. But I think it's just an example of how, climate justice, it can sound like a straightforward concept, but it very much depends on who you are and I suppose what your starting point is. But I did also want to make the point that even though the COPs get kind of all the attention and all the media and so on, they're not necessarily always the best way. In fact, they're, I would say, most of the time not the best way to try and get climate policy through, because you're looking at 200 countries agreeing on something, So it's, as we can see, right, it's very slow. If we can look, we have people like Professor John Sweeney in the room who could testify, you're talking about decades just to get the mention of fossil fuels in a climate negotiations. It's completely absurd. So we spend, but they are important and we need to have them, but we also need to not over prioritize them, I suppose, and we would be involved in a lot of kind of less formal policy spaces that can also can move faster, actually, and just one example of that, and some of you might have heard of this, we were involved in this declaration at COP. So again, not it's what we call inside the room, outside the negotiation room. So a sort of a less formal process of having a declaration on relief, recovery, and peace. And this is about basically trying to address the situation that countries affected by conflict get about a third of the climate finance that other kind of low-income countries get. So and obviously, as you might imagine, and this is certainly the case in countries like South Sudan, climate change is actually making the conflict worse, and yet they get a third of the finance that other people get. So we signed that declaration, but I think more importantly, a sort of a smaller group of us, there was kind of 82 countries that signed the declaration. It's a sort of small group of us, kind of more, maybe we would consider ourselves champions. We kind of got together last month to sort of say, okay, how can we now leverage the fact that 82 countries, 43 organizations signed this declaration? How can we leverage that to actually get stuff done and to get money flowing in the right way? So that's just one example of the, it's not a formal legal governmental negotiation, but there's still ways to get stuff done. And then the final thing, because even though my clock isn't working, I know I'm getting these kind of daggers from Ross. So I will say that one more example, just to give you a sense that we do on climate policy is also kind of our role, I suppose, in headquarters in the department, in building the capacity of our colleagues all over the world, in embassies all over the world, but also in other headquarters units. So in an embassy, it might be, giving them support so that they can, maybe be lobbying, say, in another country for stronger climate policies in the country where they're working. There might be an Irish aid program in, Vietnam or in Tanzania and so on. So they might work with those governments on that stuff. But also we work with our colleagues that are working on, food systems. They're working on, health or whatever, to look at how can climate be integrated there. So the one kind of example, which I hope a number of you might have heard of, I suspect you have, is when we tried to get a climate and security resolution passed at the UN in New York to try and get, and again, to people in this room, this will seem a bit ridiculous that this hasn't happened already, but to get a commitment that the Security Council will be systematically considering climate and everything that it does on peace and security. Believe it or not, even though it's ridiculous that we had to do that, we still didn't manage to do it. Our resolution was vetoed by Russia. No great surprise there. But the good news is that almost every country in the General Assembly, or most countries in the General Assembly, signed to sort of say we support Ireland and Niger's resolution. So we took it as a moral victory, and we hope it sort of helps the next set of colleagues who will try and get this through. So that was really my message, is that there's lots of different ways to do climate policy, and depending on what you want to achieve, then it's important to try and pick the right one. So I maybe leave it at that, Ross.
Thanks, Sinead. Fantastic. Our next speaker, who will momentarily appear on the screen, I believe, or should, is Sushila Pandit. Sushila is a climate and resilience professional with over 14 years of experience in climate change and disaster risk management. She works at the interface of policy, practice, research in and around locally led adaptation, anticipatory action, local indigenous knowledge, policy and governance. She's won several awards and fellowships as a climate activist, and has led many transformative climate resilience projects and programs. Currently, for example, she is serving as program co-chair for the community-based adaptation conference happening in Arusha in Tanzania, and she's a fellow in Plan Adapt, which is in Germany. Somehow, she is also finding time to write a PhD on climate adaptation and policy at the University of Kent. Sushila, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ross. Thank you, everyone, for having me, and it's really interesting to have joined this panel, also virtually maybe. But talking about policy making, as my former panelist was also mentioning about the COP and the long processes, we need to be really aware of who is defining the policy and what is the problem or the issue that is associated. Because I come from a background where I promote community-based adaptation and more locally led adaptation. Sometimes these conferences, the big negotiations help shape the idea, but we somehow miss out the locally led action, the locally led innovations that we want to promote on. And also who is paying the cost behind it, who is leading the talk, and also who is being heard on that policies. That's a real big issue and concern that we all need to raise on. And policy making is not just as straightforward as he was mentioning. It's like a long 11-month process, and you see just few weeks on the television. So it's not a straightforward thing, and there are not only the negotiators, the policy makers, but a big group of civil society and other people who want to have their voice, the local indigenous peoples who want to have their voice on that big forum as well. And also it's not a magical pill that you have a policy and everything is sorted out. That's also not true. So it's really a complex issue, and it's really indeed a very strong element, but on the same time, it's really a mixed approach, I think. And as I was saying, I was working for more than a decade on climate adaptation space in Nepal, and I was quite fascinated with understanding how this policy making actually works. So my PhD that I joined on is School of Politics and International Relations here in the University of Kent in UK. I try to figure out how this policy making actually works. So my PhD is around how these international conferences, the policy and the plans, actions on the international conferences are diffused to the national level and then to the local level where the local policy is happening, the municipality level. So I'm trying to dig down deeper and understand the context. What is the diffusion mechanism? Who is the player on this diffusion? And how this is supporting or hindering the institutionalization of climate policies in a country. Because sometimes you feel like if you are forced to do something, you will do it, but it's not institutionalized, it's not implemented. So is this really a good way of doing a policy making? As we are also discussing about it, it's really like the UN find a system and then every country follow it. Is it really working, or is it really strong enough? How we have this, because we are talking about inclusivity issue, we are talking about generational justice. Is there a justice if we do this more of a top-down approach, or we really want to promote a bottom-up leadership-led approach, like local-led approach? So that's a quite one side of me trying to explore this issue. But as Rosh also said, I'm also joining this group of locally led adaptation champions where we do this annual conference called Community-Based Adaptation Conference. And this is the 18th series now, which is we are doing on Africa in Tanzania, Arusha. Around 300 people will be joining us, and it is like around the globe conference. It's a global conference. So we're trying to bring on, because as we're talking about the generational justice, we talk about race, we talk about the age differences, we talk about geographies, but sometimes we miss out to talk about the colonial legacies that we carry on, because it's been a very strong embedded issue of colonial legacies that is shaping not only the climate space, but our mentality as well. Like even the thinking, people have this mindsets and the consequences that we are dependent on something or we are dependent on somebody, maybe the West is the other thing that we have carried through the colonial legacies. So this year we are trying to prioritize on CBA about how to challenge this colonial legacy, how to decolonialize climate action. So we have justice on that front as well. So I think I've taken a lot of time, but I will be happy to discuss about these issues on diffusion and decolonizing climate action further in our talks as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sushila. I'm sure we will return to that topic later on. Our third speaker today is Róisín Greaney. She is a climate justice researcher at TASC, which is the think tank for action on social change. Her research sort of takes TASC's expertise in inequality to advancing climate justice and realising a just transition. As part of TASC's People's Transition work, Róisín is currently working with communities in Waterford and the South Kerry Gaeltacht to explore how climate action can reduce inequality and be an enabler of local development. Prior to joining TASC, Róisín worked for several years in the not-for-profit sector with Greenpeace Australia Pacific and more recently with Concern. I feel obliged to add that Róisín was a graduate of our MSc in climate change here at DCU. Róisín.
Thank you, Ross. It's good to be back, and it's nice to hear some cheers somewhere in the crowd about the Masters. I suppose I want to start by saying that there exists this really vicious cycle between climate change and inequality, and that in this cycle, initial inequality leads disadvantaged communities to suffer disproportionately from the severe consequences of climate change, resulting in even greater inequity. And in their seminal work on climate change and social inequalities, Islam and Winkle described this kind of playing out in two broad spaces, the first being in a within-country setting and the second being between countries. Our work at TASC to date around climate change and inequality has mostly focused on that within-country setting, and for me at a really local level. But I'm very, very glad that we also have perspectives from Sinead and Sushila as well on that between-country context. I think there are many types of social inequalities that we can and we should consider when we think about climate or environmental justice. These can include characteristics like race and age or gender, as Sushila said, colonial legacies as well, inequality in relation to asset ownership or wealth inequality, and of course inequality in relation to access to decision making as well, and who gets a seat at the table. And I think it goes without saying that a person or a group of people can and often do experience one or many of these inequalities all at the same time, by which I suppose we understand as intersectionality. And I think there's a real benefit to posing the question of the panel today: how can policy address long-term climate inequities in Ireland and abroad? Because from my perspective, as I understand it, framing it in that way kind of marks a departure from the very usual discourse of at a national level, you know, how can we tackle the climate crisis in a way that just doesn't make anyone's life worse than it is now? Whereas I think the way this is framed allows us to kind of explore, how can we actually use this moment of incredible transition and change and unprecedented public investment? How can that be harnessed to improve standards of living and reduce persistent and pervasive inequality in our societies? I think when we begin to consider these more structural inequities, we can start to think about a just transition or a fair transition as an opportunity to create a fairer economy and a more equal society than the one we have now. And this is the kind of thinking that we explored last year in a project that we did with Clare Public Participation Network. That project was called Fair Clare, and it looked at the impact of the transition on groups experiencing and people experiencing poverty and marginalisation in County Clare. And something that came up amongst many things, and this is just by way of example, but something that came up through our community engagement phase was this feeling that people felt that care work was really undervalued and underpaid across Clare, especially considering the amount of care work that people have to do against a backdrop of an ageing population. So among several proposals in the report, we explored the idea of reconceptualising what we mean as a green job, and we recommended broadening that out to include decent work in all areas where labour contributes to caring for others or caring for the environment. TASC published its People's Transition Model in 2020, which was written by Sean McCabe, and that report warned that the way in which future climate action is implemented will determine whether communities are further burdened or regenerated as a result of climate action. And that model views climate action as an enabler of local development, as Ross mentioned. It aims to listen to the hopes and aspirations of people, and it aims to develop kind of community-led climate action that responds to people's local needs and priorities at the same time as tackling inequality. And we're currently working across the country with communities, I suppose, using a bottom-up approach in both rural and urban areas to bring some of these ideas to life. And to conclude, Ireland's climate change assessment published by the EPA earlier on this year, it described how tackling inequality and poverty and deprivation in a just transition could actually bolster support for climate action at the same time as improving living standards and supporting the creation of fair work. And in the same vein, President Higgins, in his address at TASC 20th anniversary last year, described this paradigm shift in thinking as having the capacity to gain mainstream acceptance because of its potential to create a more egalitarian society. He described it as not only an important gesture towards intergenerational solidarity, but he also described it as our only hope as a global people of avoiding both ecological and social catastrophe. Thank you.
Thanks, Róisín. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Darren Clarke, my colleague, who is an assistant professor of environmental geography here at DCU. His research spans topics including global environmental change, environmental policy and governance, social vulnerability, and environmental psychology. He's currently chair of the BA in Climate and Environmental Sustainability Programme, which again I'd like to plug. His interdisciplinary research focuses on the dynamics of adaptation as a social and governance issue, and how transformation of vulnerable communities can be facilitated in adapting to external shocks like climate change. Darren, please.
Thanks very much, Ross. So when I was asked to be on this panel, I'm delighted to be on it, and I have one quick fix you'd be delighted to hear. How can policy address long-term climate inequities? It's not really as simple as one quick fix, but when we think of building on what Sinead and the rest of the speakers have said over the last kind of 15, 20 minutes, when we think of climate inequities, it's not so much that it's a climate inequity, but it reflects broader societal inequities that exist. For example, if we take health and housing, probably two of the biggest issues that we face at the minute in Ireland. And unless we address the root cause of these issues and fundamentally address these root causes, then climate change will affect those people who have issues around health and housing. And so two examples of that, if we take the likes of health. So for poor communities often live in areas that are much more susceptible to climate risks like flooding, like drought, like heat waves. They live in heat islands areas of the city that are in cities that tend to be a lot hotter than surrounding areas. They live in areas with poor air quality. And people living in these places are less resilient to extreme events. So again, that's just a simple example of the impacts of health. It's not so much a climate issue as it is broader root causes of vulnerability. The second example that I have on this is when we think of housing, there are huge social inequalities, inequities when it comes to climate change. I'd say if I ask for a show of hands here, 1 in 3 of us, roughly speaking, would put up their hands to say that they're renting, or broadly speaking, it's roughly 30% of the population in Ireland rent nationally. There's currently no obligation on landlords to provide energy-efficient homes to those people that rent. And so effectively, they are at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to having an energy-efficient home that maybe a private house owner could afford with all the energy upgrades. So for me, there are huge issues, root causes, I think, that underlying drivers that climate inequities show the root causes of broader social issues. And so I was asking myself over the weekend, what can we do to address this? And I went back to a book that I read a couple of years ago, and it's by a professor in the UK called Jason Hickel, and it is about degrowth. And I read it again, or read sections of it again this morning, because I had nothing better to do with my time. But I was reading some sections of it this morning around how we can shift our entire societies and our economies to a system that currently just doesn't work, whether it's those that are most vulnerable or the climate crisis. So for me, we radically need a new way of thinking about our economies, and I think some speakers this morning were arguing that, or some of the questions this morning for Mary Robinson were arguing for that. So, for example, GDP doesn't take into account care work. It doesn't take into account a lot of the things that can't be valued in society, or you can't actually put an economic value on. And we saw that play out in the recent referendum and the issues around care work and things like that. But we also see that it does take account of things that are ecologically, environmentally destructive, like deforestation. We can count in terms of when we destroy a forest, we create GDP. When we overfish, we create GDP. So it's not an actual true measure of how well things are functioning, how well society is functioning, how well the environment is functioning. And so radically, and I fundamentally do believe this, whether we like to admit it or not, this involves a huge reduction in consumption of resources of the wealthiest people, which for most of us is we are those wealthiest people. We are some of the wealthiest people in the world, and a more equitable distribution of what resources remain on the planet. And I think we need to radically shift away from what well-being is. GDP is one way in which we measure well-being from an economic point of view. It's a very crude way. For me, it's an awful way of measuring GDP. And the guy that developed GDP, Simon Kuznets, he was an economist, a Nobel Prize winner. He advised governments against using it as a measure of progress, and yet and with all, it is still our dominant means of how we measure well-being. So I think we fundamentally need to move away from how we consider well-being. There are broader measures of well-being around social, physical, mental, environmental health that we need to consider. GDP just does not work. It creates a lot of the crises, including the climate crisis that we're currently in. And so that's probably one of my main arguments. And we need to change really what we consider well-being to be if we're to address the climate crisis, because as it stands, we're currently projected to be somewhere in the region of about 2.8 degrees Celsius based on what countries have 2.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times, based on what countries have committed to in national policies. And that is just simply a world that's not compatible with human life or any form of life that as we know it. So the current economic system doesn't work. There are millions, if not billions, of people that are not benefiting from it. And we fundamentally, I find it really hard to believe that we can send people to the moon, we can do all these wonderful things, we can have huge innovations in technological advances, but we can't imagine another world that sits outside economic growth or GDP. And I think that's a damning failure of society, but more so of political processes that kind of fail to sell us a better future, because for a lot of people, we're just not seeing the real benefits of what economic growth should offer.
Thanks, Darren. So I just have a couple of questions for each of the panelists, and then we're going to open up the discussion to the floor. Going back to Sinead for a moment. So you've been a part of the COP process. You've sort of seen what's happening behind the scenes there. I mean, when the loss and damage fund was agreed upon, how big a development was that? How significant is it, and what can we hope from it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ross, because I mean I think it's very important that we don't associate loss and damage too much with climate justice. This is going to sound like a strange thing to say, but I think if we're talking about loss and damage, it's too late for climate justice. Like, loss and damage is about the worst impacts of climate change, and like, I mean, maybe just to give people an example of some of what that looks like in some of the work that we would be involved in, or that we would be in discussions on. Like, you have communities in Fiji where, you know, they're sort of reasonably close to the coast. Sea level rise now has gotten to the stage where they just can't exist anymore. So there's sort of international support going to helping these communities relocate inland. So you're talking about the livelihoods that they've ever known. You're talking about where their parents and grandparents and other ancestors are buried. You're talking about, you know, where they prayed, etc. You know, you're talking about every part of their lives. And you're uprooting them and you're putting them somewhere else. And that can be considered loss and damage support for that to happen. But, I mean, it's better than not supporting them, because they do need to move, but it's hardly justice. And so I think, you know, one of the really important, it sounds like a strange thing because I have spent so much of my time working on loss and damage, but it's not, mitigation is the only hope of climate justice, really. You know, I mean, loss and damage is in some ways an acknowledgement of failure. I'm sure Sushila would have quite a lot of thoughts on this topic as well. But I think it's important for us to bear that in mind. Do we need to do it? Yes, we need to do it, but let's not get carried away. What we need to do even more, and I think people from small and developing states tell us this all the time. They're like, what we really want you to do is mitigate, you rich countries. You know, we don't necessarily just want you to give us, you know, sort of some money so that we can cope slightly better with some absolutely terrible impacts. So I think that maybe just to put the sort of loss and damage into context a little bit. Is it important? Should we do it? Yes. The board of the new fund is just starting to meet this month. Actually, we're on the board, and you know, we'll try and make it work as well as possible, and we'll try and get that prioritization for the most vulnerable countries. But it can't be a reason for us to turn our attention away from mitigation.
So it's almost a process that has injustice baked in.
It is the result of injustice, yeah.
Terrific, thank you. Sushila, if I can turn to you for a moment. So you've got quite a lot of experience as an activist, and I'm wondering, you know, what are the differences and complementarities between the perspective of an activist and the perspective of a policymaker when it comes to climate resilience and the sort of things that you work on. And then just another question, if you don't mind. You mentioned decolonization and decolonizing mentalities in relation to climate action. I mean, decolonization is a word that we often discuss in universities and so on. It's a term, it's often invoked, but how do you really meaningfully decolonize climate action?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rosh. Talking about the activism, I started my career as a young climate activist, so I was following the COP negotiations as well as a young climate activist campaigning outside. We used to do this fossil fuel awards where a country who did not do like a commitment on the COP, we give them like the fossil award. So these types of activity we used to do when we were like doing these young climate activist movements. But soon on the process, like I want to share that with many people because we are having these eco-anxiety issues as well, because a lot of the young people, they have a lot of hope from these big conferences and big negotiations and big countries. And when we go on this front and want to advocate, want to be heard of, but we are not heard of because the things will be happen on a closed door. The negotiators will be on the closed door, and the voices that we raise outside, sometimes it's really hard to penetrate to that level. As we were talking about the issue of the GDP as well, we know that it's not a good parameter to measure. We know that there is a fund available because he was mentioning that there is a fund to go to the moon. There should be a fund to do something on your mitigation side as well. But what prioritize the big nations? Who is prioritizing on what? We can see the war right now. There's a lot of investment on war going on. If we had a sense of equality and prosperity and a justice, we had like moved that amount of war to climate movements or development movements rather than the big wars that's happening around the Russia-Ukraine or the new Iran-Iraq wars. Everywhere there is a huge investment going on, but we are still complaining that there is a lot of financial gap, like the funding gap on adaptation forefront. So there is a lot of these issues which is making the young people more anxiety, like eco-anxiety. Like they are not seeing hope in the processes. They are not seeing hope in whether really a policy will do something on the ground or it will be too late to address that. That's a big concern happening as well. So yeah, I also belong to that group of people who is like, maybe not that much of hopeful, like things will go good, but we still need to do things because we can't rely on the big nations will do a good thing. We need to have a continuous fight on this. Like we need to really push forward on the issues and do things. But that's a big concern, and I'm really happy to hear that the representative from Irish government is so positive on this issue. I'm hearing from the first-hand negotiators. I'm really happy that there are people on the ground who really want to push these issues, but the majority, the majority of them will be a different front where we really need to penetrate. Talking about decolonization, I really want to push this idea because when I can share you an example. When we were working in Nepal back then, my department head, he was like well on disaster and climate, like he has a well expertise on this. And we had a small consultation workshop in ministry. So there was one UK master's student who come for a volunteering on our organization. So we took him as an experience to have this consultation workshop on ministry. And you can see like people, it's like deep inside, it's already mentally felt like when they see a white-skinned people, they thought like they will be an expert on the topic. Although he was just a volunteer trying to learn, people were like, expecting his expertise on the topic. He don't know the context, he don't know the country, he don't know the scenario and the topic. But he was asked like, what is the solution for this? What is the expert opinion? So when we have this, it's so deeply bedded inside that sometimes we don't have this agency on ourselves that we may be aware of these things. We ourselves have the solution for the issue. We ourselves is like more more upfront, and we can do it by ourselves. The confidence I also come from a least developed country, from Nepal, so the confidence on the people on the least developed country sometimes will be so much like shallowed or pushed down that although they have the strength, they have the capacity, they will feel that it's not right enough, it's not good enough to showcase to the world. So that has a big legacy that colonialization has put on. And to decolonize, it's not just to decolonize the action right now. Sometimes we have a debate like where this decolonization word come from, whether it's again the colonial countries again saying, okay, no, we need to do a decolonization action. So where this starts from is another debate that we need to have on. So that's the scenario right now we are facing around on the injustice front in the climate debate on decolonization.
Thank you, Sushila. This actually transitions really nicely to what I wanted to ask Róisín Greaney about, and that's really what a bottom-up approach to just transition looks like, and what that means in practice. I mean, drawing maybe on your work with communities in Clare and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. I think, in taking a bottom-up process, it's quite a different context in which we're working, but what Sushila said still applies. When we start to work with a new community in Ireland, we don't know the local context. We don't know what the issues are there. We don't know what the solutions should be, and that's, for me, I suppose, in taking a place-based approach in our work, it's about grounding that work in the lived experiences and needs and the kind of agency of the people that are living in that place. I'll give an example of a project I'm working in this year in Waterford City. That project is supported by AIB, and we're working with two mid-sized, I suppose, communities there called Larchville and Lisduggan, and they're just about 2 kilometres southwest of the city, kind of bordering SETU, the campus there. And they're classified by the Pobble Deprivation Index as being the two most disadvantaged, I suppose, electoral divisions in Waterford County, and some of the most disadvantaged in the state. Although I really should say you don't feel that when you're there. It's a wonderful, fantastic place. Our work it kind of has 3 broad phases. The first phase would be this kind of quite short mapping phase to get a sense of the community, start meeting with people there, understanding places where people are meeting, analysing census data and things like that to get a sense of what could be barriers to engagement. And then we spend quite a decent chunk of time really listening to and learning from the people in that place. And we've spent the guts of 9 months of it on this project in Waterford, and it's tricky. It takes time, but it's wonderful work as well. And it's so, I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it's also great fun, which I think is important for everyone involved to stay hopeful. We're lucky to be working with a local development company in Waterford City called Waterford Area Partnership, and it's through them that we've been able to work with their community development worker and then meet the local residents association and also meet with people that it's that because of those barriers to participation that it is trickier to meet. So people living with disabilities, people with restricted mobility. We've met with young people, we've been into the schools, we've met with people in recovery from addiction, older community members as well, and the list goes on. But it's really because we're able to spend that time kind of developing trust and working with that local organisation. But I suppose the aim of that process really was to understand what the needs are in the community and how do we align these with climate solutions. And we were talking about this idea of an imagined future this morning. We also held a visioning session with the community a couple of weeks ago, in which we kind of took the needs we had already explored and thought, what could this place look like in 20 years' time? And it's interesting, I suppose, I always find that the climate piece doesn't actually need to be that explicit. It can be implicit. very quickly we were coming to ideas about the need for warmer and insulated homes, the need for more green space and things like that, without even really talking about climate action. So I guess in that sense it made our work very easy to align climate action to their needs. But the main challenges that were coming up were around poverty, mainly energy poverty, challenges around mental health, and a need for pathways for young people away from crime. So taking those few things, we're kind of in the process now where we're kind of developing these things in more detail, but we're looking at a whole of community approach to retrofitting and what that might look like, as well as ideas around green spaces for mental health. You know, when you look at, they have tree cover maps in Waterford, and when you look at these two communities on the map, there's a real dearth of tree cover comparing to other parts of the city, other more affluent parts of the city. So it's a really obvious justice issue as well as hopefully responding to some of the mental health challenges locally. But I suppose, we're going to be launching that in June and bringing together both the local community and stakeholders in the area as well. And I think it's important to say that the local community should have ownership over their future and what that should look like, but they shouldn't have to do it alone either. There's a real role for the state and local organisations to play an active role in that as well.
Thanks, Róisín. So, Darren, you were brave enough to bring up the issue of GDP and economic growth. I think most of us would agree that the majority of members of Dáil Éireann, if they were to come out and say, I'm anti-growth, they would consider that to be political suicide. So how much appetite do you think there is socially and politically for, at the very least, growth agnosticism?
I felt I probably peaked about 10 minutes ago and should have just left. That was the easiest option.
Rookie mistake.
Yeah, rookie mistake. In terms of political support for it, it challenges the dominant assumptions that politicians are elected on and what we've all bought into. It's very, very difficult to achieve politically. There's no question. And the reason why it's very difficult to achieve politically is because it needs to get rid of big money from politics. Not just in Europe, but actually in some of the major political powers in the world. If you look at the US system, the Republican Democrat system is hugely dependent on donations from big industry. It also needs radical media reform. So that's a significant thing as well, in the sense that where we get our information sources from, there's a huge bias in media outlets, small, huge players, and very few of them in some countries, and that dictates the narrative that the public get as well. It means, and these are uncomfortable decisions for politicians, it means getting rid of monopolies or big players that control too much power, of too much resources. And again, it demands that politicians have the courage and the power to challenge these monopoly industries that exist, including fossil fuels. It needs to move to more co-ownership of cooperative structures in everything we do, in our entire way of living our lives. So more cooperative structures where society actually has a stake in the businesses that are being developed and what they look like. And it means, and actually we've seen some of this, putting workers, not necessarily workers we've seen, but putting workers on company boards. And we've seen in the last couple of years that some of the biggest fossil fuel companies, shareholders are demanding that climate activists sit on those boards now, which to me is huge progress, at least, because that didn't exist 5-10 years ago. It would have been unheard of, but it means we need much more of workers sitting on company boards. And it means fundamentally democratizing governance structures. And we've seen a sliver of that, at least in my mind, we've seen a sliver of that with the citizens' assemblies. There is huge appetite. If you ask the Irish public, at least, if you ask most countries, most democratic societies, you ask them if they want to take action on climate, the fundamental answer is yes, they want to take action on climate. So it means fundamentally changing our governance structures, how decisions are made, who gets to make them, how much influence lobby groups and big business and all of these things have. And so that's the political side, and that is the enormous challenge. When you talk about is there social readiness, there is absolutely social readiness. I think the person's name this morning was Anya, who spoke from the audience about setting up Extinction Rebellion. There is social readiness because there are movements happening. Greta Thunberg, who started the Fridays for Future. There are social movements happening now that did not exist 5 to 10 years ago, demanding action on climate change. And that is a significant starting point to where we were. We have citizens' assemblies where we had 100 people representative of the population of Ireland demanding action, resoundingly demanding action on climate change, on biodiversity loss. And we have speakers this afternoon, the children and young people from the children and young people's version of the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss, demanding the same. So there is huge potential for and huge appetite for change. Even if we go back 10 years ago, I think of the Arab Spring uprising. That was based on the premise of social inequalities, political inequalities that existed in the Arab world at that time. And so there is huge appetite for change. And people are, this session is on inequities. People are marginalised, disadvantaged, more so now than they ever were. Climate change is magnifying that. There is huge appetite for change. We need to see more action from the public, that's you and I, but broadly speaking, that the change is deeper than you and I getting out and doing our bit on a Fridays for Future march or whatever it might be. It is the political systems that really fundamentally need to buy into degrowth, or at least GDP not being the dominant means of how we assess well-being. And we've seen, and I'll finish on this point, but we've seen three leaders, and three female leaders, in fact. Nicola Sturgeon, they no longer are in positions of power, which might tell you something, but Nicola Sturgeon, Jacinta Ardern, and I forget the first name of the Icelandic Prime Minister, but they all committed about 3 or 4 years ago to moving away from economic growth as a primary means of assessing well-being in their countries. And they have decided that well-being is bigger than that. It's about the social cohesion, it's about the health and well-being more broadly, and they agreed fundamentally to start bringing discussions away from GDP. And maybe we need more women in politics for that to happen.
Excellent. Thanks, Darren. We have about 5 minutes, I think, for a question. So this lady here, if the microphone is... No, yeah, the microphone's pretty close by. Yeah, there you go.
Thanks to all the panel. That was brilliant. I have a quick question for Darren. Darren, you never mentioned universal basic income. Do you think it could be part of the solution in a move away from GDP and towards more equality and well-being, I guess? Thanks.
Yep, absolutely. Universal basic income, just as a background, it is a commitment by the state, usually, to provide a baseline level of income to everybody, regardless of their background, whether you're rich, poor, or whatever, somewhere in between. And it's been trialled in many countries. Probably one of the most successful in recent years is in Finland, if you look it up. And it improved health outcomes, universal basic income. They trialled it for a 9 to 12 month period, I think, or something around that. And it improved health outcomes for those people that were able to avail of it, or that were selected as a sample from the government chose a sample. To a sample of the population, and it improved well-being outcomes. It fundamentally improved them. There's no example, to my mind at least, globally, where universal basic income exists on a great scale. It's been trialled in different cities. It's been trialled for short term, for 9 to 12 months. But it takes the risk of falling into poverty, all of these things that maybe don't give people an opportunity to be involved in climate movements because they literally are working day to day just to keep things going and can't think about what the future might hold. If you have at least a basic income that guarantees that you won't have to worry about your next paycheck to pay all your bills, and this was in addition to it, it could absolutely, I believe it as a fundamental role. And there's been talk around it in an Irish context, but nothing to any great extent. Oh, is it? Okay. Oh, the art sector, but I mean more broadly, it's not been rolled out more broadly. Yeah, so sorry, the art sector is but more generally, it's not been rolled out. And I think if we're to really reduce inequality, I think that is going to be a key way that we do it. Yeah.
So I had a few questions at the back here. The gentleman in the hat with the glasses, and then if the microphone is nearby. And if I could ask audience members to keep questions very succinct and same for the responses. And then afterwards, I'll go up to the balcony.
Thank you. Kia Minswu, University College Cork. This is a question for Sinead, and really a request to just expand on the discussion of the Just Transition workstream. So were there things you found surprising or anecdotes about how the process worked that you didn't expect, or other things that you might think would be interesting about how that process went? Thanks.
Do you mean loss and damage?
Sorry, I said Just Transition. Yeah, I meant loss and damage, exactly. Thank you.
I'd hand the microphone over to Róisín. To be honest, it was surprising that we agreed. We didn't initially agree. When we got to the end of our last meeting, we still hadn't agreed. So we had to go into extra time, as it were. So I think it was great. It was great that we agreed on something with extremely... And like, to be frank as well, sometimes in the media, you get the sense like, oh, this is a big fight between developed countries and developing countries. Actually, a lot of the biggest arguments were among those groups, right? There's a huge, especially you have to remember, the developing countries group in climate negotiations is from 1990, so it's an enormous group. It includes Saudi Arabia, and let's not even go there. In terms of that list needs a bit of a revision, to say the least. But so to have all those countries agree, I think was something, and we got. I think we got a decent agreement. We definitely all had to compromise. But at the same time, we got something that we could all live with. And in a climate negotiation, I think that is really important. In some ways, the hardest work is going to start now, and I think it's good that Ireland's on the board, of that, because I think I don't know who it was earlier this morning who said it's all very well to have your beautiful, kind of policies. And I think Mary Robinson said it also about, in the Irish context. But really, it's about the implementation. I think, Róisín, you've talked about this as well. And I think, so I think there is going to be hard work at the board. It meets for the first time later this month. And we're going to have to keep a very sharp eye to make sure that those kind of provisions, especially for the most vulnerable countries, are actually rolled out, in a way that really does serve them. So we'll be there with our hawk eye. You can be sure about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sinead. A very final question, and then we'll have to wrap up. Yes, lady here.
Hi, I'm just member of the general public in the art sector. But I wanted to ask you, where do you position yourself towards the banks? Because they're the agent that is actually changing, or that has the reins of where money is put, who gets subvention for what. How do you actually tackle that huge issue? I mean, because it's not even nation-wise anymore. It's really, they don't have any nationalities. They're just really global powers.
Thank you. Who would like to take that as a final word?
I'm not sure where that question came from. I can't.
Up here.
Okay.
Up here.
Yes. So financial systems have a huge part to play in the problem. Again, I was reading Jason Higgle's book again this morning, as I said, but and in it he talks about financial systems and how they are set up to continue with capitalism, basically the dominant means of how we produce and consume, and fundamentally we should be potentially be changing how the financial system operates, that they shouldn't be able to lend money that they don't actually have to lend. They can do that at present, that they should have to have 100% capital on deposit for the same amount that they want to lend. That's not the way the system works, but again, that comes back to the bigger political issue around changing the bigger systems, the bigger powers at play that would need to change for that to happen. And I, again, am a fundamental believer in that change needing to happen.
So thanks, Darren. And unfortunately, we are out of time for this panel, but please join me in thanking all four of our panelists for a terrific discussion. Thank you.